The screaming wind carries death. Across the white wasteland that was once green Europe, a family of 5 huddles around dying embers. The father's hands shake, not from cold, but from the knowledge that tomorrow there may be no wood left to burn. His children press against him, their breath forming ice crystals in the air. Above them, walls of ice tower 2 miles high, grinding southward with the sound of 1,000 avalanches. This is not some distant planet. This is Earth, 20,000 years ago. Welcome to the last glacial maximum, when ice ruled the world and humanity balanced on the razor's edge of extinction. But here's what they don't want you to know. The truth about what happened then isn't buried in dusty academic journals. It's carved into the very ice beneath our feet, written in languages of desperation that our ancestors left behind. And if you think this is just ancient history, if you believe we've evolved beyond such primal terror, then you haven't been paying attention to what's happening right now. Before I show you the signs we're ignoring today, before I reveal the dark, shocking evidence that finally concludes we're already sliding toward the next great freeze, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell, because what you're about to learn isn't just history, it's prophecy. And the powers that be would rather you never heard it. The mammoth's trumpet echoes across the tundra like a war cry against the dying light. Its massive form casts shadows on snow that hasn't melted in 1,000 years. Behind it, a hunting party of early humans moves like ghosts through the twilight, their spears tipped with obsidian, their eyes hollow with hunger. This is survival stripped to its bones. The ice didn't come slowly. That's the lie they tell you in school, that climate change takes millennia, that nature moves with geological patience. The truth is written in the ice cores that scientists pull from Antarctica and Greenland, time machines that reveal Earth's deepest secrets. In the space of a single human lifetime, forests became graveyards, rivers turned to stone, entire civilizations vanished beneath advancing walls of ice that moved like slow-motion tsunamis, devouring everything in their path. The Scandinavian ice sheet stretched from the Arctic to the heart of Germany. The Laurentide ice sheet buried most of North America under ice thick enough to crush mountains. Sea levels dropped by 400 feet. The English Channel was a valley. The Mediterranean was a desert lake. And humanity, we were reduced to scattered bands of survivors clinging to life in the narrow strips of land that the ice hadn't claimed. Listen to the wind howling through the caves of Lascaux, where desperate artists painted by firelight, not just for art, but as prayers to gods who seem to have abandoned the world to endless winter. Watch the shadows dance on the walls as they tell stories of the green world that existed before the ice, stories that must have seemed like impossible dreams to children who had never seen a tree. These weren't primitive people. Archaeological evidence shows they had complex social structures, sophisticated tools, deep spiritual beliefs. They were as intelligent as we are, as capable of love and hope and terror. The only difference? They lived in a world where winter could last for 10,000 years. Feel the weight of that knowledge pressing down like the ice itself. In the caves of southern France, archaeologists have found something chilling, literally. Layers of ash and bone that tell the story of humanity's darkest hour. Cannibalism, infanticide, the abandonment of the old and weak. These weren't monsters. These were people exactly like us, driven to unimaginable choices by a climate that showed no mercy. The Norse called it Fimbulwinter, the terrible winter that would precede Ragnarok, the end of the world. 3 years of snow and frost without summer, when brothers would turn against brothers and the very foundations of civilization would crack like ice under pressure. They thought it was mythology. We know better.
Native American tribes across the continent shared eerily similar stories. The Great Freeze, when the spirits of winter declared war on all living things. The Hopi spoke of the world turning white and still. The Inuit, masters of the ice, told tales of ancestors who remembered when the cold was so fierce that even their gods wept frozen tears. These weren't random myths, they were cultural memories, passed down through generations like genetic scars. The Greeks had their own version, the eternal winter that Demeter unleashed when her daughter was stolen to the underworld. But what if these stories weren't metaphors? What if they were distorted memories of real events, real trauma, real ice? Scientists drilling into the Greenland ice cap pull up cylinders of frozen time. Each layer tells a story, not just of temperature, but of atmospheric composition, volcanic eruptions, cosmic dust, the very breath of ancient atmospheres. And what they're finding changes everything. The transition wasn't gradual, it was violent. In some cases, temperatures dropped by 15 degrees Fahrenheit in less than a decade. Imagine your local climate suddenly shifting to match northern Alaska, not over centuries, but in the time it takes a child to grow up. Ecosystems collapsed overnight. Megafauna that had roamed the Earth for millions of years vanished in the blink of a geological eye. The woolly mammoth, the saber-toothed cat, the cave bear, the giant ground sloth, all gone, not through hunting alone, but through a climate apocalypse that left no room for giants in a world suddenly ruled by ice. But here's what should terrify you. The ice cores show this has happened before, many times. Climate isn't the stable, predictable system they want you to believe. It's a wild animal that's been sleeping, and we keep poking it with sticks. The last glacial maximum ended roughly 12,000 years ago, but its ghost still haunts us. Every winter storm, every unexpected freeze, every polar vortex that plunges southward like an ice-cold dagger, these are echoes of that ancient terror. And the most chilling part? The evidence suggests it's all connected. The myths, the archaeological record, the ice cores, they're all pointing to the same terrifying truth. If it happened once, it can happen again, faster than we imagine. The answer lies in a dance that's been going on for millions of years, a cosmic waltz between Earth and space that determines whether our planet freezes or burns. But someone, or something, is changing the music. Dr. Milutin Milankovitch died in 1958, probably thinking his life's work would remain buried in obscurity. The Serbian mathematician had spent decades calculating something that seemed impossible: how tiny changes in Earth's orbit could trigger massive climate shifts. His colleagues dismissed him. The scientific establishment ignored him. They were wrong, catastrophically wrong. What Milankovitch discovered was that Earth doesn't orbit the sun like a well-behaved planet. It wobbles, it tilts, it stretches its orbit into eccentric ovals and then snaps back to perfect circles. These changes happen over thousands of years, and they're so subtle that without precise instruments, you'd never notice them. But the ice notices. The ice always notices. These cycles, the wobble, the tilt, the orbital stretch, they're like the gears in a cosmic clock that's been ticking since the planet formed. And every so often, the gears align in a way that plunges Earth into deep freeze. The wobble takes 26,000 years. The tilt cycles every 41,000 years. The orbital stretch follows a 100,000-year pattern. When these cycles synchronize in just the right way, they create what scientists call orbital forcing, a fancy term for cosmic bullying that can lock our planet in ice for millennia. But here's where the story gets truly terrifying. In 1993, researchers drilling into the Greenland ice sheet made a discovery that changed everything. The ice cores revealed something that shouldn't exist according to conventional wisdom: abrupt climate transitions, not gradual changes over millennia, but violent flips that happened in decades, sometimes in years.
The Younger Dryas, 12,800 years ago. The name sounds harmless enough. It comes from a tiny Arctic flower that suddenly started appearing in places where it had no business growing. But that innocent-sounding flower marked one of the most catastrophic climate reversals in human history. Picture this. The Ice Age is ending. Glaciers are retreating.
Early humans are emerging from their caves, spreading across continents, discovering agriculture. For the first time in thousands of years, hope is blooming along with the flowers. Then, without warning, winter returns with a vengeance. In the span of a human lifetime, temperatures plummet. The retreating glaciers stop, regroup, and surge forward again. The Sahara, which had been turning green, reverts to desert overnight. Early farming communities that had taken root across the Middle East watched their crops wither and die as frost returns to haunt their dreams. This wasn't supposed to happen. Climate doesn't work that way, the textbooks said. Change takes millennia, not decades. The textbooks were wrong. The Younger Dryas lasted 1,300 years. 1,300 years of renewed Ice Age conditions that struck just as humanity was learning to build permanent settlements. Archaeological evidence from this period is heartbreaking. Abandoned villages, mass graves, the complete disappearance of entire cultures. But some survived, and what they built in the aftermath still stands today, silent testimony to climate trauma. Göbekli Tepe rises from the Turkish hills like a stone fever dream, massive pillars arranged in perfect circles, carved with symbols that seem to scream warnings across millennia. Built around 9500 BCE, just as the Younger Dryas was ending, it's the world's oldest temple complex, older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids. Some archaeologists believe it wasn't just built after the climate catastrophe, it was built because of it. Imagine the survivors of the Younger Dryas, traumatized by over a millennium of renewed ice age, finally seeing the glaciers retreat again. They would have lived in constant terror that winter would return. They would have built monuments to appease whatever gods controlled the sky and ice. They would have carved warnings for future generations. The pillars of Göbekli Tepe are covered with images of scorpions, serpents, vultures, and wild boars, symbols of chaos and death. But there are other symbols too, mysterious ones that might represent celestial events, climate patterns, the very cycles that Milankovitch would calculate thousands of years later. Were they trying to predict the next ice age? The Chinese have their own memory of abrupt climate change. The Great Flood of Yu the Great, dated to around 2200 BCE. According to legend, Yu spent 13 years controlling floodwaters that threatened to destroy civilization. But what if these weren't ordinary floods? What if they were the result of sudden climate shifts, rapid glacier melt, the kind of violent weather transitions that we're seeing echoes of today? Hindu cosmology speaks of yugas, vast cycles of time where the world alternates between golden ages and dark ages, creation and destruction. The Kali Yuga, the age of darkness, is described as a time when ice and fire battle for control of the earth. Ancient knowledge or ancient memory? Every culture that survived long enough to develop writing systems has stories of sudden, catastrophic climate change. The flood myths, the endless winters, the times when the sun disappeared and the world nearly died. These weren't fantasies, they were survival guides, encoded in religious imagery and passed down through generations because forgetting meant extinction. Scientists studying ice cores from Antarctica have identified over 20 abrupt climate transitions in the last 100,000 years. 20 times when Earth's climate system flipped like a switch, plunging the planet into radically different conditions in the space of decades. The most recent one? The Little Ice Age, which we'll explore later, but the point is clear. Earth's climate isn't the stable system we pretend it is. It's a complex, chaotic, highly sensitive mechanism that can shift into entirely new configurations with terrifying speed. Think of it like a coin spinning on a table. For most of its spin, it looks stable, predictable. But eventually,
it has to fall. And when it does, there's no predicting which side it will land on.
The Milankovitch cycles are still turning. The cosmic gears are still clicking toward their next alignment. And according to the calculations, we should be heading into the next glacial period. Should be. But something is interfering with the natural rhythm. Something is disrupting the cosmic dance that has governed Earth's climate for millions of years. The question isn't whether the climate will shift again, it's what form that shift will take and how soon it will arrive. The ice cores whisper of rapid transitions. The archaeological record screams warnings. The orbital mechanics point toward an inevitable change. And this pendulum may already be in motion. History teaches us one powerful lesson. Nothing lasts forever. Not empires, not kings, not even entire civilizations. But stories? Stories only survive when they're passed on. So if you've made it this far, don't just be a silent traveler through time. Hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because if you don't, this story may vanish into the noise, just like the civilizations we speak of. Don't let it be forgotten. The furnace is burning hotter than ever, so why are the rooms getting colder? In your house, when the heating system breaks down, you don't get gradual cooling, you get a catastrophic failure. The furnace keeps roaring, fuel keeps burning, but the circulation pump dies, and suddenly the heat can't reach where it needs to go. Pipes freeze, rooms turn to ice boxes. The harder the furnace works, the more dangerous everything becomes. Now imagine that house is planet Earth. The furnace is global warming, and the circulation pump is about to fail. This is the paradox that climate scientists whisper about in worried conferences, but rarely discuss in public. The terrifying possibility that our warming world isn't moving us away from the next ice age, it's triggering it. And if you think this sounds impossible, you haven't seen the evidence I'm about to show you. Deep beneath the North Atlantic, a river flows in darkness. Not a river of water, a river of destiny. Warm surface water from the Caribbean travels north, carrying tropical heat toward Europe like a liquid lifeline. As it cools in the Arctic, it becomes denser, heavier, sinking to the ocean floor before flowing south again in the depths. Scientists call it the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC for short. But you can think of it as Earth's central heating system, a massive conveyor belt of water that has kept Europe habitable for thousands of years. Without it, London would have the climate of northern Canada. Paris would freeze like Siberia. Scandinavia would be uninhabitable. The Gulf Stream, which is part of this system, carries as much heat northward as 1 million nuclear power plants running at full capacity. But the conveyor belt is slowing down. And if it stops completely, the fire of global warming will call forth the ice of a new glacial age. The warning signs are already here, written in the language of salt and temperature that oceanographers are desperately trying to decode. Off the coast of Greenland, something apocalyptic is happening. The ice sheet, 2 miles thick in places, containing enough frozen water to raise global sea levels by 20 feet, is melting at an accelerating pace. But here's the crucial detail that most people miss. It's not just melting, it's flooding the North Atlantic with fresh water. Fresh water is lighter than salt water. It doesn't sink. It sits on the surface like a lid, disrupting the delicate density differences that drive the oceanic conveyor belt. It's like pouring cooking oil into a pot of boiling water. The oil floats on top, creating a barrier. Now imagine that barrier covering millions of square miles of ocean, preventing the normal circulation that has regulated our climate for millennia. This isn't speculation. It's happening right now. Dr. Stefan Ramstorff of the Potsdam Institute has been tracking the AMOC for decades. His measurements show the circulation has weakened by 15% since the 1950s. Other studies suggest it's the weakest it's been in over 1,000 years. But the real terror lies in what happened the last time the AMOC shut down completely. 12,800 years ago, the Younger Dryas, the same catastrophic cooling event that traumatized our ancestors and inspired the monuments of Göbekli Tepe.
The ice cores tell the story with crystalline precision. As the last ice age was ending, massive Lake Agassiz, a glacial lake larger than all the Great Lakes combined, burst through its ice dam. Billions of gallons of fresh water flooded into the North Atlantic in a geological instant, shutting down the oceanic conveyor belt like flipping a switch. Within decades, Europe plunged back into ice age conditions. Glaciers that had been retreating surged forward again. The brief spring of post-glacial civilization withered and died. It took 1,300 years for the system to restart. Today, we're conducting the same experiment on a global scale. Greenland loses 280 billion tons of ice every year, equivalent to dumping 280 billion tons of fresh water directly into the engine of our climate system. The Arctic sea ice, which once reflected sunlight and helped maintain the temperature differences that drive ocean circulation, is disappearing at a rate that stuns even the scientists who study it. We're not just warming the planet, we're performing surgery on its circulatory system with a chainsaw. The signs of distress are everywhere, if you know how to read them. The polar vortex, that ring of ultra-cold air that normally stays locked around the Arctic, has become unstable, wobbling like a broken gyroscope. When it wobbles, it sends tongues of Arctic air plunging southward into regions that aren't prepared for such extreme cold. Remember the Texas freeze of February 2021? Temperatures dropped to 19 degrees Fahrenheit in Dallas, colder than Alaska. The power grid collapsed, pipes burst, people froze to death in their homes. The economic damage exceeded $100 billion. That was just a taste, a warning shot from a climate system under stress. Europe has been experiencing similar disruptions, winters that start late but hit with unprecedented ferocity, heat waves in summer followed by brutal cold snaps that catch everyone off guard. The jet stream, the river of air that normally flows west to east in orderly waves, has become erratic, creating blocking patterns that trap weather systems in place for weeks. This is what happens when you break the circulation system of a planet. Scientists studying the collapse of past civilizations have identified a pattern. The Norse colonies in Greenland thrived during the medieval warm period when the North Atlantic circulation was strong and reliable. Viking ships could navigate Arctic waters that are frozen solid today. They built farms and churches, raised cattle and sheep, traded with Europe across thousands of miles of open ocean. Then came the cooling, the Little Ice Age. The AMOC weakened, the Gulf Stream shifted, and suddenly Greenland became what its name implied, a land of ice and death. The Norse didn't leave gradually. Archaeological evidence suggests a rapid abandonment. Farms were left with livestock still in the barns. Churches were abandoned in the middle of construction. Entire communities simply vanished, leaving behind only bones and ruins. And the haunting question, what did they know that we don't? They knew that warmth is fragile. They knew that the ocean currents that bring life can disappear without warning. They knew that civilization exists at the mercy of forces far beyond human control. We've forgotten these lessons, but the ocean remembers everything. The computer models are terrifying in their implications. If the AMOC collapses, not weakens, but actually shuts down, Northern Europe would cool by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius within a decade. That's enough to trigger widespread glaciation. Ice sheets would begin forming in Scandinavia and spreading southward. The growing ice would reflect more sunlight back to space, cooling the planet further in a feedback loop that could lock us into a new glacial age. But here's the most chilling part. The models show this could happen even as global average temperatures continue to rise. The Arctic melts, the oceans warm, but Europe freezes. Fire and ice existing on the same planet simultaneously. It's already starting. Satellite measurements show that while most of the world has warmed over the past century, there's a cold spot in the North Atlantic, a region of cooling water right where the AMOC circulation is strongest. Scientists call it the warming hole, but it might be more accurate to call it the cooling warning.
This is what climate chaos looks like. Not a smooth, predictable warming, but a violent reorganization of Earth's entire energy system. Floods in some regions, droughts in others, heat waves and ice storms, tropical storms spinning into the Arctic while polar air invades the tropics. The ancient myths make sense now. The Norse Fimbulwinter wasn't the opposite of global warming, it was the consequence of it. The Hindu cycles of fire and ice weren't metaphors. They were memories of a climate system that swings between extremes like a pendulum gone mad. We're poking that pendulum with a stick made of greenhouse gases and melting ice. We're adding energy to a system that's already unstable, not knowing whether it will tip toward fire or ice. The circulation models suggest we have maybe a decade or two before reaching a tipping point, maybe less. The fresh water pouring off Greenland is accelerating. The Arctic sea ice is disappearing faster than anyone predicted. The AMOC is weakening at a rate that would have been considered impossible just 20 years ago. What happens when the conveyor belt of the Earth finally stops? The Thames is frozen solid. For the first time in living memory, you can walk from London Bridge to the Tower of London without getting your feet wet. The year is 1683. The river that has been the lifeblood of English commerce for 1,000 years has turned into a highway of ice thick enough to support entire markets. Merchants set up booths on the frozen surface. Children play football where ships should be sailing. Someone has even opened a tavern in the middle of the river, serving hot ale to customers who never dreamed they'd be drinking in the middle of the Thames. They call it a frost fair, but there's nothing fair about what's happening to the world. This is the Little Ice Age. And if you think it sounds quaint, like something from a Christmas card or a Dickens novel, then you haven't grasped the true horror of what a climate shift can do to human civilization. The cold didn't come alone. It brought famine. It brought plague. It brought wars and revolutions and the collapse of empires. It brought death on a scale that makes medieval battles look like schoolyard skirmishes. And this was just a preview of what's coming. The Little Ice Age wasn't little. That's propaganda from textbooks that want to minimize the terror of climate change. What happened between the 14th and 19th centuries was a glimpse into humanity's future, a preview of what happens when Earth's thermostat gets stuck on freeze and civilization has to choose between adaptation and extinction. It started slowly, the way nightmares always do. The medieval warm period was ending. Vineyards that had flourished in northern England began failing. Harvests grew smaller. Winters lasted longer. But then the system flipped. Suddenly. Violently. Glaciers that had been retreating for centuries reversed course and began advancing. Alpine villages that had existed for generations found themselves in the path of rivers of ice that ground forward like slow-motion avalanches, devouring farms and forests and entire communities. The Baltic Sea froze solid, not just the shoreline, but the entire sea, allowing armies to march from Denmark to Sweden across what should have been open water. The Bosporus, the narrow strait connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, iced over for the first time in recorded history. But the real devastation was agricultural. Crops failed across Europe year after year. The growing season shortened by weeks, then months. Farms that had fed families for generations became frozen wastelands where nothing would grow. Famine followed, then plague, then war.
The year 1315 marked the beginning of the Great Famine, 7 years of crop failures that killed millions across northern Europe. People ate bark, grass, anything that might provide nutrition. Parents abandoned children they couldn't feed. Villages became ghost towns. The social fabric that had held medieval society together began tearing like frozen cloth. But the climate hadn't finished with Europe yet. The Black Death arrived in 1347, carried by rats and fleas, but enabled by climate chaos.
Populations weakened by decades of poor nutrition and brutal winters had no resistance to the plague. Within 5 years, 1/3 of Europe's population was dead. 25 million people erased by a combination of disease and climate catastrophe. Think about that number, 25 million dead. Not from war or natural disaster in the traditional sense, but from a shift in global temperature of just a few degrees. The Little Ice Age killed more people than both world wars combined, and it did it slowly, relentlessly, over centuries of grinding suffering. The social consequences were revolutionary, literally. The French Revolution of 1789 wasn't just about political inequality. It was triggered by crop failures, bread riots, and economic collapse caused by volcanic winters and climate instability. The same pattern repeated across the continent. Climate stress led to social stress, led to political upheaval, led to bloodshed. Marie Antoinette supposedly said, "Let them eat cake," when told the peasants had no bread. What she didn't understand, what no monarch of the era understood, was that the bread was gone because the climate had changed. The crops were failing not because of poor farming, but because the sky itself had turned against agriculture. The guillotine fell on necks, but it was wielded by climate change. In China, the Ming Dynasty collapsed in 1644 after decades of climate-related catastrophes. Droughts, floods, famines that killed millions. The social order crumbled when the crops failed, and the Manchus swept in to establish the Qing Dynasty over the bones of climate victims. The Ottoman Empire, which had dominated the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries, began its long decline during the Little Ice Age. Repeated harvest failures led to economic crisis, social unrest, and military weakness. Climate change didn't just reshape the map of Europe, it redrew the boundaries of entire civilizations. But nowhere was the impact more devastating than in the colonies of the New World. The Norse settlements in Greenland, the same communities that had thrived during the medieval warm period, simply vanished. Not gradually, not through warfare, but through abandonment. Archaeological evidence suggests the colonists tried to adapt, switching from agriculture to hunting, eating their livestock, even consuming their own horses and dogs as the cold intensified. The final archaeological layers tell a story of desperation. Tools abandoned mid-task, graves left unfinished. The last written record from the Greenland colonies dates to 1408, a wedding certificate, optimistically recording a marriage that took place as civilization was collapsing around the couple. What happened to the survivors? Some may have tried to return to Europe. Others might have integrated with Inuit communities. Most likely, starved or froze to death as their agricultural society proved incapable of adapting to the new reality of permanent winter. The lesson is clear. Civilization is fragile. Social structures that seem permanent can collapse in a single generation when the climate shifts beyond their ability to adapt. Even in regions that didn't freeze completely, the Little Ice Age transformed daily life in ways that would horrify modern populations. Winters that lasted from October to May. Rivers frozen for months at a time, cutting off trade and transportation. Crop yields so low that famine became a regular visitor rather than a rare catastrophe. The cultural impact was profound. Medieval art from before the climate shift shows lush landscapes, abundant harvests, people dressed lightly even in winter scenes. Art from the Little Ice Age period becomes darker, more ominous. Paintings of frozen rivers, snow-covered villages, people bundled in layers of clothing, even indoors. Literature changed too. The concept of winter as a season of death and despair became embedded in European culture during this period. Before the Little Ice Age, winter was just another season. Afterward, it became synonymous with suffering, isolation, and mortality. The Brothers Grimm collected their fairy tales during the depths of the Little Ice Age. Is it any coincidence that so many involve frozen landscapes, evil winter spirits, and heroes who must survive impossible cold? These weren't fantasies. They were survival guides disguised as stories, teaching children how to recognize the signs of climate catastrophe.
The technological adaptations that emerged during the Little Ice Age read like a manual for post-apocalyptic survival. Improvements in heating systems, better food preservation techniques, new methods of agriculture that could function in shortened growing seasons. But here's what should terrify you. All of these adaptations were developed to deal with a climate shift of just 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. The computer models for the next ice age suggest temperature drops of 10 to 15 degrees in some regions. Imagine New York with the climate of northern Alaska, Los Angeles with winters like Minnesota. The entire American agricultural system redesigned around growing seasons that last 3 months instead of 6. The Little Ice Age finally ended in the mid-19th century, not because humanity learned to control the climate, but because the natural cycles shifted again. Solar activity increased, volcanic eruptions became less frequent. The oceanic circulation patterns that drive European weather stabilized in a configuration that brought warmth back to the North Atlantic. We got lucky. The planet's thermostat reset itself to a comfortable temperature just as we were developing the industrial technology to extract and burn fossil fuels on a massive scale. But luck runs out. The natural cycles that ended the Little Ice Age are shifting again. The solar patterns, the oceanic circulation, the delicate balance of atmospheric chemistry that keeps our climate stable. All of it is changing. Now imagine not a few centuries of chill, but thousands. The Little Ice Age was a minor fluctuation compared to a true glacial period, a preview, not the main event. It killed millions and reshaped civilization. A real ice age would end civilization as we know it, forcing the survivors to rebuild society from scratch in a world where most of the planet is uninhabitable. The question isn't whether this will happen. The geological record shows that it's inevitable. The question is whether we'll be ready, or whether we'll join the Norse colonists in the archaeological record as another civilization that couldn't adapt when the climate changed. The echoes of the Little Ice Age are all around us if we know how to listen. Every winter storm that overwhelms our infrastructure, every crop failure that destabilizes global food markets, every refugee crisis triggered by climate extremes. These are prophecies of what's coming. The real storm hasn't even begun. February 13th, 2021, Texas. The power grid dies with a final gasping wheeze. 40 million people plunge into darkness. Water pipes explode like gunshots in the night. Families huddle together as their homes transform into ice tombs. The temperature plummets to minus 19 degrees Fahrenheit. People burn furniture to survive. In 4 days, over 200 souls freeze to death. The politicians call it a once-in-a-century storm. The experts shake their heads and whisper about unusual weather patterns. The news moves on to other stories, but the scientists who study ice cores, the ones who read the ocean's pulse like a heartbeat, they're terrified because they know what Texas doesn't want to hear, what the world refuses to acknowledge. what ancient myths have been screaming at us for millennia. The warnings are all around us. We're just too blind to see them. Before you dismiss this as another climate scare story, before you click away to something more comfortable, ask yourself this. What if everything you've been told about global warming is only half the truth? What if the real terror lies not in the heat, but in the ice that follows? If you're brave enough to learn what's really coming, what the data actually shows when stripped of politics and wishful thinking, then subscribe. Because what you're about to discover isn't just science, it's survival. The signs started appearing decades ago, scattered across the globe like breadcrumbs leading to disaster. Arctic sea ice melting at record rates. Scientists cheered, finally, proof of warming, they said. But they missed the real horror hiding in those numbers. All that fresh water, millions upon millions of gallons pouring into the North Atlantic, disrupting something so fundamental, so critical to our survival that its collapse could trigger an ice age within decades. The Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, the AONC. Think of it as Earth's central heating system, a massive conveyor belt of warm and cold water circulating around the globe. Warm water flows north, cools, sinks, and returns south deep beneath the surface. This system has kept Europe habitable for thousands of years. It's dying. In 2018, scientists published data showing the AMOC had weakened by 15% since the 1950s. By 2021, that number had grown to 25%. Climate models suggested we had centuries before collapse. They were wrong. New research shows the tipping point could arrive this century. Some studies suggest we're already past it. Dr. Stefan Rahmstorf, one of Europe's leading climate scientists, put it bluntly. We may be witnessing the beginning of a dramatic climate shift that could happen faster than anything in human history. But the warning signs aren't just in computer models and research papers. They're written in blood and ice across our recent past. Remember the beast from the east? In 2018, a polar vortex split and sent Arctic air screaming across Europe. Temperatures dropped 40 degrees below normal. Snow buried cities that hadn't seen winter weather in decades. Britain ground to a halt. People froze to death in their homes. The media treated it as an anomaly. Scientists knew better. The polar vortex, that swirling mass of ultra-cold air normally trapped above the Arctic, has been destabilizing for years. Climate change weakens the jet stream that keeps it contained. When it breaks free, it brings Arctic conditions to places utterly unprepared for such devastation. It happened again in 2019, and 2020, and 2021. Each time more violent. Each time reaching further south. These aren't random weather events. They're the planet's fever dreams as it struggles to maintain balance in a system we've broken. Look at the mythology. Look at what our ancestors were trying to tell us. The Norse spoke of Thimblevinter, 3 consecutive winters with no summer between them heralding the end of the world. Hindu texts describe cycles where the world freezes before rebirth. Native American legends tell of times when winter refused to end, when the spirits of ice conquered the spirits of warmth. Were these just stories? Or were they memories? Oral traditions that carried the trauma of past climate shifts through generations, disguised as mythology to ensure they survived when the literal truth might be forgotten. Consider the Maunder minimum, the period from 1645 to 1715, when sunspot activity nearly disappeared and the world entered what we now call the Little Ice Age. Rivers froze solid across Europe. Crops failed for consecutive years. The population of Iceland dropped by half. But here's the terrifying part. It wasn't gradual. Archaeological evidence shows the transition happened within a single generation.
Children who played in warm summers grew old during endless winters. Their folktales speak of sudden change, of seasons that refuse to turn, of summer becoming a memory. We're seeing the same patterns now, but we call them different names. Unusual weather, extreme events, climate volatility. The euphemisms can't hide the truth. Dr. Michael Mann, director of the Earth System Science Center, recently admitted what few scientists dare say publicly. The climate system appears to be far more unstable than our models predicted. We may be facing changes that occur not over centuries, but decades. The Gulf Stream, that warm river of water that keeps Britain from freezing like Siberia, has slowed to its weakest point in over 1,000 years. Ocean temperatures in the North Atlantic are dropping despite global warming elsewhere. European weather stations report increasingly erratic patterns. Warm spells followed by devastating cold snaps, spring arriving weeks late, autumn stretching into December. The seasons themselves are becoming unstable. But it's not just Europe. In 2019, the American Midwest experienced a polar vortex so severe that it was colder than Antarctica. Schools closed for days. Mail delivery stopped. The cold was so intense that it literally froze people's breath in their lungs.
Chicago recorded temperatures of minus 27 degrees Fahrenheit. It was colder than the South Pole. These aren't isolated incidents. They're symptoms of a climate system in collapse, lurching between extremes as it searches for a new equilibrium. The food system feels it first. In 2012, a late spring freeze destroyed fruit crops across the American Midwest. Farmers who had planted early, trusting in consistent weather patterns, lost everything. Food prices spiked globally. In 2018, unexpected frosts in Europe wiped out vineyards that had thrived for centuries. Wine regions in France and Germany reported their worst harvests in decades. These aren't just economic losses, they're warnings. The agricultural systems that feed 7 billion people depend on stable, predictable seasons. When those patterns break down, civilization follows. Ancient civilizations understood this. The collapse of the Akkadian Empire, one of the world's first, coincided with a sudden drought and cooling period around 2200 BCE. Archaeological evidence shows mass migrations, warfare, and societal breakdown, all triggered by climate instability. The Maya faced similar challenges around 900 CE, when irregular rainfall patterns and temperature drops contributed to the abandonment of their greatest cities. History is littered with civilizations that thrived during stable climate periods and collapsed when conditions changed. We like to think our technology makes us different, but our supply chains are longer, our systems more complex, our populations more concentrated. We're more vulnerable, not less. The warnings are accelerating. In 2023, European scientists published data showing the AMOC was closer to collapse than previously thought. Computer models suggested a 50% chance of shutdown before 2060. Arctic ice is melting faster than the worst-case scenarios predicted just 5 years ago. The Greenland ice sheet alone is losing over 250 billion tons of ice annually. That's not just a statistic, it's a flood of fresh water disrupting ocean currents that have remained stable for millennia. And still, we ignore the signs. Still, we pretend that gradual warming is our only concern. Still, we refuse to acknowledge that our planet's climate doesn't change slowly and predictably. It snaps from one state to another with breathtaking violence. The ancient myths weren't just stories. They were warnings from survivors of the last great climate shift, passed down through generations in the only way that could ensure they wouldn't be forgotten. The ice remembers. The ocean remembers. The earth itself remembers. The question isn't whether the next ice age is coming. The question is whether we're already living through its opening act. Manhattan, December 15th, 2041. The last subway train died 3 days ago.
Sarah Chen pulls her scavenged coat tighter as she navigates through what was once Times Square. The billboards went dark months ago, their screens cracked by ice that no one expected, no one prepared for, no one believed could happen. Not here. Not in the 21st century. Not with all our technology and predictions and careful plans. The snow reaches her waist now, accumulating faster than the few remaining city workers can clear it. But it's not the snow that terrifies her. It's the silence. 8 million people don't just vanish. They migrate. They flee. They run toward any rumor of warmth. Above her, icicles hang from skyscrapers like the fangs of some massive, sleeping beast. This is what the end looks like. Not fire and explosion, but ice and abandonment. But Sarah isn't living in 2041. She's living now in 2025, and what she just experienced was a glimpse, a possibility that grows more probable with each passing winter, each weakened ocean current, each ignored warning sign. The question that haunts every climate scientist willing to speak honestly isn't whether this scenario will unfold.
It's how much time we have left to prepare, and the answer is terrifying. The collapse, when it comes, won't announce itself. There won't be a countdown timer or a global alert system. One year, winter will arrive early. The next, it won't fully retreat. Gradually, then suddenly, the world we know will transform into something unrecognizable. But we can see it starting now if we know where to look. The Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, that great conveyor belt of ocean current that has regulated Earth's climate for millennia, shows all the signs of a system approaching collapse. The warning signals aren't subtle. They're screaming at us from every measurement, every data point, every computer model. When the AMOC fails, not if, but when, Europe will plunge into an ice age within decades. Think about that. Not centuries, not millennia, decades. London could experience the climate of northern Canada. Paris could face winters like Siberia. The agricultural systems that feed hundreds of millions could collapse in a single growing season. Dr. Tim Lenton, director of the Global Systems Institute, put it starkly. We're looking at a climate system that could flip like a light switch. And once it flips, there's no going back, at least not on any timescale relevant to human civilization. The Ice Age, when it begins, won't start gradually. Earth's climate system doesn't work that way. It jumps between stable states like a ball bouncing between valleys. For the past 11,000 years, we've lived in one valley, the warm, stable period that allowed human civilization to flourish. But the ball is rolling toward the edge. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that winter had arrived 3 months early. Not just cold weather, true Arctic conditions. Snow that doesn't melt, temperatures that don't rise, growing seasons that disappear entirely. The economic collapse would be immediate and devastating. Supply chains built on just-in-time delivery would snap. Food shortages would appear within weeks. Energy grids designed for temperate climates would fail under the strain of unprecedented demand. But the real catastrophe would be human. Cities like New York, London, and Chicago would become unlivable. Their populations, millions upon millions of people, would be forced to migrate southward, creating the largest refugee crisis in human history. Political systems would crumble under the pressure. Wars would erupt over habitable land. This isn't science fiction. It's applied climatology. The Younger Dryas period, 12,800 years ago, offers a preview. Within a few decades, global temperatures dropped by up to 15 degrees Celsius. Ice sheets advanced across continents. Sea levels fell by 120 feet. The transition was so rapid that human societies barely had time to adapt. Archaeological evidence shows mass migrations, the abandonment of settlements, and the collapse of early agricultural communities. The humans who survived did so by reverting to hunter-gatherer lifestyles, abandoning the settled communities that had begun to form.
We like to think our technology makes us more resilient than our ancestors. In reality, it makes us more vulnerable. Our food system depends on global supply chains, predictable weather patterns, and intensive agriculture. When climate systems collapse, these advantages become liabilities. A society that grows its food in vertical farms and relies on global trade is more fragile than one that knows how to hunt, gather, and survive in harsh conditions. The early warning signs are already visible to anyone willing to see them. The Texas freeze of 2021 was a glimpse of what happens when modern infrastructure meets sudden climate shifts. Power grids failed, water systems froze, people died in their homes because their society wasn't designed to handle rapid temperature changes.
Now scale that up. Imagine not 4 days of extreme cold, but 4 years. Not one state, but entire continents. The agricultural impact alone would be civilization ending. The American Midwest, Europe's breadbasket regions, Russia's grain-producing areas, all would become uninhabitable within a generation. Food production would collapse, hundreds of millions would face starvation, political systems built on abundance and stability would disintegrate. Democracy requires a certain level of comfort and security to function. When people are freezing and starving, they turn to strongmen who promise survival, not politicians who promise debate. The migrations would dwarf anything in human history. The Syrian refugee crisis, which destabilized European politics, involved millions of people. An ice age would displace hundreds of millions, potentially billions. Where would they go? The equatorial regions, already struggling with heat, water shortages, and political instability, would face an influx of climate refugees that would overwhelm any capacity to absorb them. Wars would be inevitable. Not wars of ideology or resources, but wars of survival. Competition for the remaining habitable land would drive conflicts more brutal and desperate than anything we've seen. But here's what makes this scenario truly terrifying: the uncertainty. Climate scientists can model the general patterns of an AMOC collapse, but they can't predict the exact timeline or the specific regional effects. The collapse could begin tomorrow, or it could take 50 years. The transition could be gradual enough to allow some adaptation, or it could be catastrophically rapid. What they do know is that the conditions for collapse are already in place. The fresh water from melting Arctic ice is already disrupting ocean currents. The polar vortex is already becoming unstable. The jet stream is already weakening. We're living on borrowed time, and the debt is coming due. Dr. James Hansen, the NASA climatologist who first warned Congress about global warming in 1988, recently published a paper suggesting that ice age conditions could develop with a rapidity that would leave no time for adaptation. Think about that phrase, no time for adaptation. No time to relocate populations, no time to rebuild infrastructure, no time to develop new agricultural systems, no time to prepare for the greatest challenge human civilization has ever faced. The mythology of our ancestors suddenly makes perfect sense. The Norse Finnbul winter, the Hindu cosmic cycles, the Native American winter spirits, these weren't just stories, they were memories, preserved in the only way that could ensure they survived across generations. Our ancestors lived through rapid climate changes. They experienced the collapse of stable weather patterns, the failure of food systems, the breakdown of societies. The survivors passed down their knowledge disguised as mythology because literal warnings might be forgotten or dismissed. We dismiss them anyway. But the Earth remembers what we chose to forget. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica preserve a record of past climate shifts that reads like a horror story. Stable periods lasting thousands of years, punctuated by transitions so rapid they appear almost instantaneous in the geological record. The most recent transition, the one that ended the last ice age, 11,700 years ago, happened within a human lifetime. Archaeological evidence suggests that within 50 years, the world transformed from glacial to temperate conditions. If it happened that fast in one direction, it can happen that fast in the other. The signs are accelerating. The ocean currents are weakening, the weather patterns are destabilizing, the system that has kept human civilization stable for millennia is approaching its breaking point. And we're not preparing. Our governments plan for gradual warming, not sudden cooling. Our infrastructure is designed for stable climates, not rapid transitions. Our food systems assume predictable seasons and reliable weather. We're preparing for the wrong disaster. The question isn't whether we can prevent an ice age. The forces involved are too vast, too fundamental to be stopped by human intervention. The question is whether we can prepare for it, whether we can build resilient systems that can function during climate chaos, whether we can develop agricultural techniques that work in shortened growing seasons, whether we can create social structures that can hold together during the greatest mass migration in human history.
Whether we can learn from our ancestors who survived the last great climate shift and apply their lessons to our modern world. The Ice Age is coming, not in millions of years, not in thousands of years, but potentially within the lifetimes of people alive today. The only question is whether we'll face it as prepared survivors or as victims of our own willful blindness. The ancient myths weren't warning us about the distant past. They were warning us about the future. Are we living at the edge of the next great freeze? Or are we already inside its first whispers, mistaking the opening movements of a climate symphony for random noise? The ice remembers. The question is, will we? Nations fall, cities crumble, and civilizations vanish. But stories survive only when they're carried forward. If this journey meant something to you, don't just leave it behind. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications. Become a keeper of history, not just a passerby.